and I've been working on a few reviews since, so my thoughts are with my other reviews, so I hope I can remember everything about this review, but I've moved on since. So it was a 2011 review. I think it was call 3. And here's the team. They were from across the world, as you can see. The final 2 reviewers came in quite near the end because we had some Spanish studies, and so we included those. I'll talk a little bit about them later. So we had those 2 reviewers that came in then. So what is TVET? Technical and Vocational Education and Training. There isn't a universally agreed definition, and it's constantly changing. So one of the jobs at the beginning in the review was to fix on a definition that we would use. But generally it's understood, that's a UNESCO definition down there, it was the acquisition of skills and knowledge for the world of the work and possibly life. But there are different components, different elements of TVET. There's technical education, vocational training, on-the-job training, and apprenticeship training. These are the most commonly understood components of TVET. The first 3 are, generally classroom-based, with the top 2 having more of a theoretical focus, and the top 1 there being kind of at the higher level, sort of above the skilled crafts, but below the professions. The vocational education is often sort of run, as it were, by the Department of Education, where the vocational training will be run by the labour department of a country. On the job training, as you can see, well, the title gives it away. That's when somebody's actually, in the job and learn. Their focus is on practical skills. And then apprenticeship training, where again on the job, you've been trained by a master craftsman. So we included all of those types of TVET in our review. It's also quite broad TVET. Well, again, not everyone agrees on this, but who's it targeted at? So in our review, and this is, most of the definitions include, what's often called IVET, CVET, and UVET. So TVET for initial employment, so for youngsters who've never actually entered the world of work yet. And then we have CVET, which is continuing vocational education and training for people who are already in work and they to upskill. And then training for the unemployed, so people who've been in jobs and are seeking work or retraining. TVET covers a wide range of settings, so it can be informal, formal, different kind of places. Can be provided by the government, by public training centres, private, third sector and traditional. So a wide range of providers. And I mentioned before, so it's not, a lot of people don't, they forget or they don't include the sort of tertiary level. You can actually get, only a few institutions, but you can actually get a degree in TVET, although it wouldn't quite be called that. So why is it seen as important? Well, financial crisis. Globally, young people are nearly 3 times as adults to be unemployed, and that's particularly in the low and middle income countries where they're much more likely to be unemployed. They're also much more likely to be underemployed or employed in low-skilled jobs and jobs with very little security, or training opportunities or working conditions are very poor. And there's 1 billion young people that are expected to reach employment age within the next decade. And in a lot of countries, there's this youth bulge. It's seen as important, partly because of the financial crisis, and this large number of people become unemployed. And there's a sort of renewed focus on this idea that if young people can be reskilled, if they can given the skills, then they can take up the sort of opportunities that are already out there. So there's a bit of an assumption really that it's down to the young people who need the attention, that the jobs are there, the opportunities are there, but we need to provide these young people with the knowledge and skills. And then there's also importance on it, for poverty reduction, but also for political security. So in some circles there's lots of talk, there's this concern that large numbers of unemployed youth is actually a threat to stability. So it was an AusAid Commission systematic review, We started it in 2011. We're looking at the effects of different models of TVET. So the focus was on teasing out the different types of TVET and seeing if we could find out which was most effective. It was focused on young people, aged 15 to 24 on average. So in some of the samples, young people were a bit older, but the average age was below 24. And it's in all low and middle income countries. And we also had a second research question, which was to look at the moderating effects. Very simple model, which really just shows that our final outcomes were employment outcomes, so gaining initial employment, re-entering employment, obtaining better employment, usually a job in the formal labour market, or self-employment. And then income, so wages and salaries, earnings, and working hours. So they were our three main outcomes. And then we also, if the studies looked at the intermediate outcomes, we collected data on these. But the studies were required to have a final outcome to be included. It was coordinated by the Campbell collaboration. So we're looking for that section of the literature that's in there, the TVET literature, the employment literature, and the impact evaluation literature. Standard procedures of a systematic review. I won't go over those. Size of the evidence base. We started with over 8,000 studies that we screened out, so our search was very comprehensive. I can't remember off the top of my head how many databases and how many websites, but there was a large, a considerable emphasis put on the non-database sources to find the low and middle income country literature. And we screened all those 8,000 odd studies, and we had, put my glasses on again, look here. So we had 52 study reports that met the inclusion criteria, but there was a lot of duplication in there, so lots of authors had published 2 or 3 times. So we had 30 studies that were eligible. We couldn't include 4, and we included 26. Publication dates for 2001 to 2011. We had 4 Spanish studies. The 4 that we couldn't include were also non-English language. Some arrived too late, some were French. There were different reasons, but they couldn't be included at the time we did the synthesis. There were only 3 randomized controlled trials, but there were 23 rigorous, they'd used a rigorous design. They weren't all necessarily very well conducted. 23 quasi-experiments. On the whole, the quality of the evidence base was quite low, to a large extent because the information was not reported, so it was the risk of bias was unclear, rather than they were seen as having a high risk of bias. They were mostly mixed samples. We had 20 different interventions across the 26 studies, and the settings were largely in South and Central America, and the outcomes were largely employment outcomes. We had only one study that looked at an intermediary outcome, which was job searching, if I remember correctly. So as well as being kind of skewed on the South America literature, we also had no apprenticeship training interventions included in the review, and they were mostly this kind of mix of a 2-phase program mixing vocational training and then on-the-job training. So this is the one here, consists of 6 sequential training modalities. 9 of the 20 were of that type. They were mostly targeted at disadvantaged or at-risk youth, so unemployed youth, poor youth. There was very little, as you see, I think there was only 2 studies that were targeted at the more highly educated, so that they were really trying to upskill young people. They were much more focused on, giving them any skills. And Central and South America. So we use statistical meta-analysis, but there are big buts with what we did. We could only calculate and include in the meta-analysis 10 of the 26 studies. There simply wasn't the data in the studies to calculate the effect sizes and include the other 16. There's a question of the missing studies. So I mentioned that we couldn't include 4 because we couldn't, we didn't actually get the papers in time, and we didn't have the reviewers to code them in different languages. And then there's the issue that we didn't actually search in the non-English language databases. We'd found these Spanish and French studies in the English language databases. So that really is a limitation of the review, especially when you think that a lot of the studies we were finding were conducted in Latin America. So there's a question of how many missing studies we have. And then there's the methods that we use for calculating effect sizes. They're underdeveloped. There's a bit of contention over what we did. Not everybody would agree with what we did because they're new and they need further testing. And yes, there was a wide range of designs and the quality of the evidence was relatively low. So that has to be taken in when you look at the results of the meta-analysis. So overall mean effects and the heterogeneity stats. So very small effects here, and they're statistically, very small effects here, and they are statistically significant. The overall paid employment, formal employment and earnings, self-employment earnings and working weekly hours worked. Well, one self-employment earnings is negative, this one's positive, but they're not statistically significant. So we took the three at the top where there was a small effect, and we tried to explain the observed heterogeneity. As you can imagine, with 10 studies, and we're doing a moderate analysis, it was quite challenging. So there were actually only 4 variables that we could test, which was the quality of the studies, the length of the outcome measurement, gender, and type of intervention. You know, we were looking at whether these 2-phase programs were more effective than the vocational education on its own, that sort of thing. We found that methods matter, and that the low quality studies had the larger mean effects than the medium quality studies on the whole. So the other independent variables tested weren't where we were unable to explain variability, and gender may have had some influence only for increase in weekly hours worked, seemed to be driven by young women. So conclusions, sounds a bit doom and gloom and to some extent. What can we say? So we can say that participating in TVET is, so it's better than not participating in terms of improving young people's chances of getting employment, gaining formal employment, and improving their earnings. Might work, there's more doubt over there whether it works better in terms of increasing the weekly hours worked of young women. What can't we say? Well, there's actually quite a lot that we can't say. We can't say that one mode of TVET is better than another, and this is really what the funder was after. They really wanted to, they're thinking of, putting their money in one type rather than other, apprenticeships or vocational education. You think of all the different sort of target groups that TVET covers. They were hoping, that word model was there from the beginning in their title, and unfortunately we couldn't say which one was better than another. We couldn't say much about the long-term outcomes. So the outcomes in the studies that we had were I think the longest one in the meta-analysis was 18 months, but they were mostly about 12 months. So we don't really know what's happening after that. And again, that's of interest to policymakers. We can't say much about whether it works for different populations, whether it works better in rural settings or urban settings. We had grand ambitions about the moderator analysis, so we planned a much larger number of variables that we'd include, but we simply couldn't conduct the analysis, so we can't say anything about them. We can't also say much about the impact of TVET relative to other youth employment interventions, because that wasn't our question. But you could argue that you have to, the systematic review has to be seen alongside that. So where does it leave the policymakers, particularly when you think that AusAid funded this review with high hopes of finding out which mode was better than others, and they were also quite, I don't know what the word is. The fact that the studies were in South America rather than the Pacific was something that concerned them a great deal. But as a systematic reviewer, there's, you only have the material that you have to work with. So there's nothing in the review, well, I would argue, that suggests that policymakers should stop investing in TVET. So on the bright side, policymakers can continue investing. as before, though, or how if you're thinking allocation of money, where should they put their money on the results of this systematic review when it doesn't say where to put their money. There needs to be a lot of investment in research, fill those gaps, all the different questions, sub-questions, particularly in relating to the moderate analysis that we couldn't answer. We need the research. If you think of all the TVET programs across the world, across low and middle income countries, and we only actually have 20 different interventions being evaluated. It's actually a very, very small proportion. And then this is just my last final point, that we got you get quite excited when you start a systematic review, and you think, especially if it's the first review, rather than you're updating one that's been done already. And then when you can't answer the policymakers' questions the way they want them answered, you get a bit downhearted. But I'd like to argue really that policymakers are a bit unrealistic if they think one systematic review, and they'll walk into a room when they're making their policy, and they'll sit down and they're going to formulate the policy on your one Campbell systematic review, which, being a Campbell review, is very rigorous. It wouldn't be published if it wasn't. But argue, you've got to think about looking at the different parts of the jigsaw. Our systematic review has to be considered alongside lots of other systematic reviews, such as the ones that are looking at different other mentoring programs, other financial interventions that can help with youth employment, and other different kinds of evidence, historical evidence, other kind of evidence, stakeholder, the evidence that they bring, and that we're just one part of the jigsaw. Okay, not forget the researchers, all that, a long list, and that's only some of them that I think researchers need to be doing to help out here. And just if you're interested, it's published in the Campbell Library, and there's also a open access journal article if you wanted to print off a quick read, since it is 176 pages, I believe. So that's it.
Okay, thank you, Janice.